Take a look at this image. This is a Lararium, a household shrine found at the House of the Vetii in Pompeii. The shrine is made to look like a real temple building, and 4 figures are depicted in a fresco in the center. 2 of the figures are Lares, household gods who hold Rhyton drinking cups and flank a central figure. The central figure, whose head is covered in the manner of priests, is the Genii of the household. Below, a winding snake symbolizes the prosperity and fertility of the household where this shrine was found. When talking about household gods in ancient Rome, we often immediately think of Vesta, the primary hearth deity whose priestesses guard Rome's eternal flame. But the Romans recognized other household deities as well. Today, we're taking a look at those other domestic deities and what they meant to everyday Romans. Welcome to Hearth of Haimonia. My name is Kate, and today we are talking about household worship and household gods in ancient Rome. Now, I'm not going to be talking about Vesta or her Greek counterpart Hestia, because I've already covered those in other videos, which I will link somewhere up here and somewhere down there. So if you want to check those out first and then come back to this, that way you get a full picture. Otherwise, let's just talk about the other ones. Now, the domestic space in ancient Rome was the center of family life, as it is for many families still today. Your home was where all of the activity of the family happened, and it really was a symbol of your family unit. In fact, the word familia in ancient Rome included all of the people in your house, and also the house itself and all of the property inside it. So the home is inherently tied to the family. And as such, domestic religion is hugely important for people who have this lifestyle. Additionally, I talked in the Vesta videos about the connection in ancient Rome between the family and the state, the home and the state. State religion was supposed to ensure the divine favor of the state, which was supposed to be one big Roman family. And so that was the macrocosm of Roman religion that was mirrored in a microcosm of the household. And as we'll see, in fact, the microcosm of the household was mirrored in an even smaller microcosm of the household shrine. So we're going to talk about all of that today. Now, obviously, individual personal religion is something that is impossible for us to get from antiquity. We only have the evidence that we have, and obviously each person, each family has their own style, has their own reasons for practicing. But there are some general trends that we can look at, both from the archaeological record and from the written sources that we have from the time period. Now, domestic religion begins with defining the domestic space and what sort of supernatural activity, what sort of supernatural beings or entities might be within the domestic space, or embodying the domestic space. We'll say the house, some people say a house has a personality. And that brings us to the Roman concept of a genius. And to address the obvious elephant in the room here, this is not the English word genius, although they are etymologically related. The English word genius refers to a person who is intellectually talented to an exceptional degree, or to the quality of that person that makes them a genius. We speak both of Albert Einstein, a physics genius, and the genius of Stephen Hawking. Genius is an inborn talent, usually thought of as beginning at birth or from a very young age, and is something that can be cultivated, but it can't be taught. The Romans had a word for this concept, the word ingenium, which meant pretty much the same thing. The word originates from the Latin verb gigno and the Greek verb gignomai, which both mean to bear or be born, to bring forth, create, give birth to someone or something. It's where Latin gets the word gens, a race, clan, or household. Each gens had a genius, an innate divine spirit that has the power to bring prosperity and safety to the household. Strictly speaking, everyone and everything had a genius, but we're only going to be talking about the domestic Genii today. To make a sort of clunky comparison, you could say that the genius of the household is kind of like a guardian angel that is assigned to watch over you and protect you and guide you and help you out. It's not the same thing as a guardian angel, but I guess you could kind of make that comparison. The genius is attached to the home, but it's mainly attached to the people in the home. So the home is like the protector of the family. And so if you move, your genius might come with you. So because of this, cultivating a relationship with the genius of your household is very important because it ensures that you have that divine protection. In the image that I showed at the beginning of the video, the genius is given the primacy of place in the household shrine. It's in the center. It's depicted as a priest with his head covered. They could be depicted in various ways. And the idea of this genius is that he is the head of the sort of supernatural elements of the household. So as he's in charge of the domestic religion, he's shown as a priest with his head covered, and he's holding a patera that's an offering dish. So he's carrying out religious functions in this little baby household shrine. And in the same way, the father of the family, the most senior male in the household, the pater familias, would be responsible for carrying out domestic religious activities. On either side of the genius depicted in the shrine at Pompeii, we see two more figures holding drinking cups. These are called Lares, and these are another type of domestic deity, perhaps the most famous and most ubiquitous domestic deity that we have. The Lares are gods of place, so they don't just govern households, they also have their abodes in places like crossroads, military camps, certain neighborhood places. Public buildings would have Lares as well. In the early days, Lares were depicted individually, but over time, they became associated with some very famous pairs. The first is the Dioskouroi, that's Castor and Pollux. And then the second is Romulus and Remus, the mythological founding brothers of Rome. Once the Lares become associated with these famous pairs, then they too are depicted as pairs. Cult worship of the Lares was not limited to the domestic space. As I said, they governed crossroads, agricultural fields, even military camps, and neighborhoods also worshipped their own neighborhood Lares. Now, what's interesting about cult worship of the Lares in the neighborhood is that the priests of the Lares were freedmen and even sometimes people who were currently enslaved. These would have been people who, for the most part, freedmen eventually get, other opportunities, but for the most part, these people were not afforded any other type of religious duty. They could not be priests of anybody else, especially people who were currently enslaved. This is like a very unique thing for the Lares. And I think this really has to do with the Lares being the gods of everybody. Right? Everybody has Lares. There are Lares in this house, there are Lares in that house, and everyone has their own familial group of Lares, usually a pair. It's not like on the state level, where the state which approved and continued the institution of slavery, slaves were barred from being in charge of religious functions that the state thought were too important to give to someone of such low status. Now, we can take issue with the Roman logic, but that's what the logic was. the fact that slaves, people currently enslaved, not just freedmen, not people who had been slaves in the past, but current slaves, could be priests of the Lares, shows that this is a different sort of divinity that we're talking about, a different sort of worship. Certainly important, certainly ubiquitous, but really a more, I don't know, gods for all of the people. There was a festival dedicated to the Lares called the Compitalia, which took place in late December and early January. I think we've missed it by now, but we'll get it next year. During this festival, people would offer honey cakes, and they would even put statues of the goddess Mania, who's an underworld goddess, outside of their doors. The Lares and the Manes, the spirits of the dead, are tied together very much because domestic worship and domestic divinities were often either conflated with or grouped together with ancestors. So there's an underworld connection there, and that, I imagine, is why the Mania statue was put out. A later source also lists poppies and garlic as an offering that's made on Compitalia to the Lares. This might be possible. I would assume that it had become popular in later centuries when this writer is writing, when Macrobius is writing, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't know if this was also popular in earlier Roman times. The Compitalia followed the trends of other Roman religious elements, and so when the Imperial period came around, the individual Lares, the neighborhood Lares, were supplanted by Imperial Lares, meaning that the emperor was styling himself as the pater familias of Rome's big happy family, and so since we're all one big happy family, let's all worship the same household gods, the same pair of gods that are worshipped in the imperial household. This is, of course, all for PR. Now, this tradition was started by the first emperor, Augustus, and another thing that Augustus did was redistricted the city of Rome. So that means that the neighborhoods would have been structured differently. So where you went to worship the neighborhood Lares, or which neighborhood Lares shrine was connected to your house, may have changed. So in a sense, Augustus really took Roman religion and reshaped it in his own image. He said, this is how we're doing it, I'm making all of these changes, and you're just gonna have to live with it. I imagine it must have been a little bit stressful. It's stressful enough finding a new voting location, but I can't imagine if you are connected to a specific set of deities and you're like all of a sudden worshiping different Lares. I feel like that must have been a little bit jarring for a lot of people. But no matter what district you lived in, your household Lares would be the same. Domestic worship of the Lares would have centered around the household shrine that is often called the Lararium to signify its connection to the Lares. And this, as you can see in the image that I showed at the beginning of this video, this is kind of like a little house. And as I've been hinting at here, this is the microcosm of the domestic microcosm of the macrocosm of state religion. So this was a place to cultivate your worship of the Lares and the Genii and any other gods that were particular to your family or to individuals in the family. So for example, if the pater familias, or if someone in the family is a merchant, then maybe you would include the god Mercury, god of merchants and travelers, on the Lararium as part of your family's particular worship. I would also imagine if one of the women in the household is pregnant, you might include some childbirth goddesses on there as well. The pater familias would have overseen all of the offerings that were given to the Lares. These would be things like honey cakes, as I said, or maybe incense. I would imagine incense probably, if not daily, then at least weekly. And in agricultural homes, this also would have included the first fruits of the harvest. And in every home, any food that fell from the table during a meal was given to the Lares. The Lares were part of the family. They were baked into the familial structure, and as such, they had a role in milestone events of the family. So just like the images of the ancestors that I mentioned in my ancestor worship video, just like that, the Lares would have been brought out if you had statues of them. Obviously, if it's painted on the wall, there's nothing for it. But if you have a statue of the Lares, they would have been brought out on special occasions like weddings and funerals. The Lares were present for all of the major moments in your life. So when a boy reached his coming of age and participated in the toga virilis ceremony, this is kind of like a bar mitzvah. It would have been done around the age of 15 for boys. Part of the coming of age ritual would have been for the boy to remove, he had a protective amulet called a bulla that he would wear throughout his childhood, to remove that, because he's a man now, he doesn't need to be protected, he can protect himself, and to put that on the Lararium and dedicate that to the Lares. Girls underwent something similar, but their coming of age was a little bit more intense. For a girl, her coming of age ceremony was her wedding day. She would have been quite young, far too young to be legally married in the United States, and she would have done the same thing, taken off her protective amulet and put it on the shrine of the Lares. But there was an additional thing that girls had to do. When they got married, they were officially changing families. So they would leave their familial home and move into their husband's home. And very often, the husband would still live with his parents or close by to his parents. So part of the marriage proceedings, we'll say, would be for the girl to give offerings to her new household Lares and her new neighborhood Lares as well. These offerings were typically a coin, so she would place a coin on the neighborhood Lararium and she would place a coin on her husband's family's household Lararium. So this was a much more intense experience for a girl. Now that's not to say that boys never moved out of their parents' houses and had never had their own lives. It's just to say that for girls, this happened at a very young age, somewhere between 12 and 16 for most girls. So still a child by today's standards. So this is a very dramatic moment in a girl's life. And so you're transitioning away from your family, and not only are you leaving your mother, your father, your grandparents, your sisters, your brothers, you're also leaving your household deities behind, and you have new household deities that you need to start cultivating a relationship with. So it's a very unusual experience. I think it's hard for me to imagine what it's like. So I just want to stress how you might have felt, right? Which, again, it's hard to tell. As I've said, the Lares are the most ubiquitous household gods that we have evidence for in Rome. We have a wealth of depictions of them in art, both two-dimensional and three-dimensional art, not to mention all the literature, of course. And in particular, I want to point out some imagery that goes along with the Lares, like we see in this image here. This is a statue of a lar holding a cornucopia, which is the symbol of abundance. Now, even though we may not think of it this way, Rome was primarily an agrarian society, and wealth, for the most part, whether in actuality or just symbolically, was measured in your agricultural abundance, your food abundance. The Roman word for money, pecunia, comes from the word pecus, which means like a herd of cattle. The little coins that you now used in this moneyed society represented your worth in cattle. The cornucopia here suggests that the lar is guarding or maybe even providing abundance for whoever the lar is connected to, whether that's a family, a neighborhood. And this is one of the main functions of domestic deities. It's to ensure the protection of the family, the safety of the family, and the security that comes with having enough food. All of the household gods contributed to the family's food abundance, but there may be no other god that is more closely connected to this element than the Penates. There are two possible etymologies for the word Penates, and they both come from the word penus, but penus has two different definitions. On the one hand, it referred to the household storeroom, so where you would keep all of your extra food, and that's how they get the reputation of being the gods of the pantry. But there's another definition that just means like the innermost most interior closed off place of something, which again was probably the storeroom, right? Doesn't need windows or anything like that. And specifically, the Penates refers to the innermost sanctum at the temple, any temple, but really the temple of Vesta if we're talking about household gods here. And we know that evidently there were Lares and Penates that were kept in Vesta's sanctuary, but this would have been considered an area that was too holy for the public to go to. Both etymologies link the Penates to domestic worship, whether that's the innermost, protected area of your home or specifically the storeroom. But the most popular way to talk about the Penates is to talk about them as gods of the pantry. In antiquity, they are very often grouped together with the Lares, and sometimes they're even used interchangeably, especially in poetry because they have different metrical values. So if you want to say household gods, but you need 3 syllables, you use Penates instead of Lares. So they're really, really closely connected together. And there you have it. That's a little bit more about domestic worship in ancient Rome. Now, I think the importance of household religion is hard to overemphasize, and it's also really elusive because we don't have very many individual testimonies of what religion meant to everyday people. The ubiquity of household shrines, the wealth of statues of Lares, and the depictions of the Genii that are really common, and the emphasis that Rome placed on Vesta herself tells us that this was really important to the Romans on the macro level and on the micro level, the state and the family and the individual. So even though we can't really speak to each person's feelings on this, we still get a sense of what the role of domestic religion would have been like for everyday Romans. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content about Greek and Roman religion and magic, spirituality, and belief in general, you can go ahead and subscribe to my channel because I post videos like this almost every week. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next video.